Welcome to the Nottingham Business School Business Leaders Podcast, where business leaders tell their stories and share their insights. All our guests have a personal connection with Nottingham Business School. So listen, learn, enjoy and share.
Debbie Hewitt has had a remarkable 40-year career in business. She is currently chair of the Football Association and a vice president of World Football. She is also chair of Visa Europe, CompareTheMarket.com and White Stuff. But Debbie started her career as a teenage trainee with Marks & Spencer's in their Newark store. She went on to become the first woman managing director of the RAC. That was in 2006. And in 2011, she was awarded an MBE for services to business and the public sector. She is now, according to British Vogue, one of the UK's 25 most influential women. And it's not difficult to see why. Debbie Hewitt, it's a great privilege to welcome you here to the Nottingham Business School Business Leaders Podcast.
Thank you very much.
So, let me just go through some of that again. I normally do a CV with the guests, but yours went off the end of the page, so I sort of abbreviated it ever so slightly. But you were the first woman managing director of the RSC after more than 120 years, the first female chair of the Football Association after more than 150 years, and now you've just fairly recently been elected as the first woman vice president of World Football, FIFA, and that's in the history of the game. Is this what the 18-year-old Debbie Hewitt had in mind when she started her career?
Oh my goodness, no. I don't think the 18-year-old Debbie Hewitt had anything in mind about her career.
Did you know? You didn't have a sniff of where things were going?
No, definitely not. I had an interest in business. I loved business, what made business tick. So I was very conscious from a relatively early age of being interested in businesses. But the thought that I could do the sorts of roles that I've had the privilege to do, no, absolutely not.
Well, a lot of people have very recently said a lot of very nice things about you, around your appointment early last year to the FA. The one that sticks out in my mind, it's very personal, but Gary Neville, who I think is a terrible cynic, called the decision inspired. So what makes you better than all the other candidates?
Oh my goodness me. Thank you, Gary, for those good words.
Money well spent.
Yeah, particularly coming from a Man United supporter.
Yes, of course, because you're a Liverpool fan, aren't you?
Exactly, yeah. So I was very grateful. I think I'm a different candidate often to many, and my experience doesn't always follow the mould. And I think, for those who are listening, it's not always predictable. And I think because I do bring quite different sorts of experiences, very often, if organisations are genuinely looking for something different rather than the tried and tested, then I give them that option. That's not what all organisations want, but the ones that have chosen me and the ones I guess I've chosen to work with too, that's been probably the common denominator.
And so, to a certain extent, this was the right time for you to be in charge at the Football Association as their first woman chair.
Well, I certainly hope so. I think, from my perspective, the opportunity to join the FA was just an incredible one, and I'm an ardent football fan. So to have the opportunity to join, one of the biggest institutions in football in England, and indeed in the world as football associations go, was just such a privilege. And I sometimes have to pinch myself when I have the opportunities that I do with the role brings me. I'm very lucky to do something that I love.
I guess like millions of other people, the last time I saw you was in the middle of the pitch at Wembley, grappling with Harry Kane's young children as you endeavoured to present him with the award for becoming England's highest ever goal scorer. It's a very public role, isn't it? I guess that comes with pluses and minuses.
Yeah, absolutely does. One of the pluses is meeting his lovely kids, beautiful kids here. Harry and Kate have got a lot to be proud of with those kids, and to be in the middle of that pitch with 80,000 people cheering at you and to behave is quite something. I'm not sure my 14-year-old twins would have been as well behaved. Yeah, you're right, it does. It's a burden and a privilege. Clearly the privileges are there for people to see, you know, to get to give Harry Kane his a golden boot, and also Ellen White, her golden boot a couple of weeks later. You know, it's a tremendous opportunity. But there are lows too. People often ask me how my job in football compares to my business roles that are pure business, and that's actually my sort of one-liner. The highs are definitely higher, but the lows are definitely lower.
Okay, so give me a high.
Give you a high. Well, Disability Cup weekend. You know, you see the impact that football can have on lives that are, you know, less advantaged, less privileged than mine, and you see the impact that football can have. That Disability Cup weekend, you're there as the chair of the FA, giving out the trophies. It's just so uplifting. It is a privilege. I'd walk the hundreds of miles it takes me to get to the venue to do it, and push to be at the front, because it's such a heartening weekend.
Okay, and then give me a more challenging task. One of the lows.
Yeah, you know, fan behaviour. You know, when referees get abused, when fans invade the pitch, people get hurt.
It's interesting you point that out, because that seems to be coming back, does it not? A bit more, but certainly the crowds have been quite well behaved in my experience in recent seasons, but there's a little bit more of it this season.
Yeah, some would say, you know, COVID's had a lot to answer for as people have been cooped up at home and eventually get the opportunity, you know, to get out and about. And what I would say is it's a small minority, but it is a small minority that spoil it for everybody. And it can be toxic sometimes. And, you know, when you see poor fan behaviour, or you see abuse of referees in particular, you know, I have a particular affinity with referees. My dad was an amateur referee. It's how I got into the game.
Here in Nottinghamshire?
Here in Nottinghamshire, absolutely, yeah. You know, you see that, and it's, you know, it's a low. For me, it's definitely a low. But, you know, it's one of the reasons to do the job. In fact, if everything was a high, it wouldn't be a high, of course, because everything has to have a sense of relativity. And the opportunity to be able to make a difference to the things that are not so good about football is important, and it's for me it's one of the attractions of the job. You know, you don't do this job just to give Harry Kane the golden boot or Ellen White the golden boot. You do this job to make a difference across society, and that's what you spend most of your time doing.
Okay. So what will you at the end of your time as chair of the Football Association? What might you see as success? What are the differences that you're trying to make?
Gosh, the one-liner probably would be more people watch, play and love football than when I joined. You know, that would be it. If that's the case, when I leave this role, I will have succeeded in my mission. It is called the beautiful game, for many reasons, but mainly because it has such a positive impact on lives. You know, for most people, it is the way that they exercise, it's the way that they learn about teamwork, it's the way that they develop as a human being, it's the way we show our emotion. There's so many good things about the impact that football can have. And so, I feel it's a real, you're looking after it for the next generation. And to leave it in a better place is a huge responsibility, and one I don't take lightly.
Do you see this as the culmination of your leadership career? I mean, you've had a long and very successful business career. This is slightly different. It's in sport, and it's very much more high profile. And is this what the rest of your career has prepared you for?
It's certainly the time I've spent in my career, and particularly the failures. I mean, you're very kind in saying, it's all success. I can show you the column inches where it wasn't successful.
Oh, we'll come to that, don't worry.
Let's just talk about the failures, definitely, the things I've got wrong, the bad judgments have prepared me for a job which is more high profile than some of the roles that I've held. And that's important. You need to be able to deal with the highs and the lows and get them in balance. and bring a sense of perspective too. And the fact that I've done a number of different roles, I think, definitely helps. I don't think of my career as, a sort of, this is the culmination, this is it, this is what I've been working to. I've never had a career plan, is the honest truth. Things have sort of happened. 3 months before this role came up, I was having a disappointment in not getting another role. So, life turns out in very different and unpredictable ways.
Would you tell us what that one was all about?
Yeah, actually, it was Gary Neville, actually, linked to Gary Neville. I'd been approached to join the PFA board. And what I really wanted was to be part of football. Professional footballers. The Professional Football Association, the Players' Union. And they offered me the role, but I couldn't take it. It was the weekend. It's taken quite a lot of time to work its way through. They offered me the role. It's gone very quiet. Clearly they were processing who they were going to appoint. And then I got this phone call on Friday night. It was the Friday of Brexit weekend. And they came back and said, yeah, the role's yours, we're delighted. And I said, well, that's fantastic. I can't believe it. But unfortunately, I need to get permission. I'm chair of Visa Europe to do any kind of role in addition to roles that I had at the time. You have to get permission from the boards that you're on.
And that was another non-exec position which you had at the time.
Exactly. And, with particularly regulated businesses, you need the approval of the regulator. So I didn't believe that the regulator would have a problem with it, but I needed to go through a process to be sure that they would approve it and respectfully give them time to approve it. And the weekend of Brexit actually happening was not going to be a weekend that the bank would see, approving Debbie Hewitt's new role was going to be one that was going to be necessarily their most important priority. So I said, you need to give me a few weeks. I need to first of all check with the boards that I'm on, that they're happy with me taking it. I hadn't told them because at that stage I didn't know there was an offer. So they said, well, we need to announce, really quickly. So unfortunately, if you can't say yes, we're going to have to withdraw the offer. So I can remember being with my kids and saying, I've just lost the job.
The job of your dreams.
Job of my dreams. I felt really upset. I felt a real failure, and I felt devastated, actually. And then, it sat heavy with me. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, a good friend of mine reached out and said, have you heard that the FA are looking for a chair?
Wow.
And why don't you throw your hat in the ring? And I was like, football clearly doesn't want me. My first experience, football doesn't want me.
But how fortuitous is that?
Amazing. Right?
So, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, the jobs which you have at FIFA and at the FA are many times bigger than the PFA job, which you turned around.
As it turns out, different, yeah. And as it turns out, I would never have been able to throw my hat in the ring for the FA job. I would have seen the PFA as an opportunity to get, as a non-exec at the PFA, it would have been an opportunity to understand the football ecosystem. Right. So it's probably a bit on rocket speed, really, from what I'd originally intended. So yeah, it's a real great lesson, isn't it? It's wonderful. Yes. I can remember feeling really low that weekend. If ever you should meet my kids, they would say, we saw our mum feeling really, truly upset,
and all of that was that all common knowledge among all the footballing fraternity that you were speaking to? Or?
No, not until I got the role. I'd talked through the interview process about being interested in football and the PFA opportunity, but I wasn't known to football at all. I'm sure they had to do a lot of Googling to work out who I was. And I think credit to Gary Neville, who I'm a massive fan of. Get credit to him that when the appointment was made, he made that comment because, he could have said, well, she's not gone to the best opportunity because he was, looking to appoint me, and he's been nothing but a supporter and been a good sounding board actually on a few things.
I see him in completely a new light. I withdraw my earlier comments
Definitely,
about
so
being
you
a cynic.
should. So you should.
So wow. So let's go back to the beginning. So your mum died when you were young. You were brought up by your dad, just up the road from here in Newark, as you've already said. And you said, I think something that you wrote. You said he taught you the virtues of hard work and teamwork. Are those virtues that have stood you in good stead throughout your leadership career?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, my dad didn't have a career per se. He worked in a factory. He had no qualifications. He left school when he was 14, 15, couldn't read and write at the time. He subsequently has learnt to, so an example of a system that, didn't care. He was a class clown. He would often describe himself, made to stand at the back because he was the class clown. And he drilled in us three kids, my sister, my brother, education is everything, education, education, education. And he realised as he got older that actually he was bright, and he is bright. He's 87 now, and he's as sharp as anything. But because he didn't have the opportunity, it kind of almost made him feel even more strongly that education was the thing that mattered more than anything. And particularly those values of always give back. He felt that, if somebody helps you along the way, everybody has a role to play, even the kid that's naughty, that he saw in himself, the kid who can't read and write. Don't never, ever, ever assume something, Why couldn't he read and write? Because he was made to stand at the back of the class. Well, how crazy was that?
Right.
Yes. He was never going to learn to read and write. And so, all of those virtues about, somebody's journey, get to understand their journey. You really do truly only understand a person when you understand their journey. They are values that are absolutely with him. It used to drive me mad as a kid, because you'd fall out with someone.
Yeah.
And you'd always expect your dad, wouldn't you, to stick up for you,
You would, yep.
Never did. It was always, what did you do wrong? Why didn't you understand their position?
Okay.
And as growing up, it was always... he was a shop steward, union shop steward.
Really? Which factory was he at?
He was at Tully Engineering.
In Newark?
In Newark,
yeah,
in Newark. And, he became the shop steward. It's classic. Taught me a lot about unions. Probably coincidental that I went to join the Players' Union. That was what interested me. Because he taught me that, unions exist. Why do unions exist? According to my dad, unions exist because management is poor. If management was really good, they did a good job, you wouldn't need unions. That was his kind of mantra. And he taught me a lot, actually, about, not so good leadership and, where and how good leadership really does build, this teamwork, the whole concept of understanding the individual, understanding how the team at work, it matters. Not being a leader that's unapproachable.
And that's what's interesting, because I get a lot of people in these interviews who talk about being guided by the parents to work hard. But that team building thing is a bit unusual. It's a bit different. And obviously you're explaining where that came from.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And it does now. He keeps me very grounded. Even now at 87 years old, something will happen. He'll read about something. You alluded to it earlier, in the press, something that an organisation that I work with probably hasn't got quite right. And, he's my biggest critic.
Oh, is it? Right.
Oh, yeah.
So your first job, famously, I think, was serving on the shop floor at Marks and Spencer's in Newark. I mean, I'm duty bound to ask you, what do you know now that you wish you'd known then?
Oh, my goodness, yeah. Probably, it's resilience is the thing that probably, over all of my career, how important it is to be able to deal with setbacks. And when you're young, you're that age, you think you know everything. And actually, Marks and Spencer, it was in the day, Marks and Spencer was a really successful organisation. And Brad, if I'm brutally honest with you, a little bit of arrogance. I'm working for Marks and Spencer,
I guess that was a quality employer in Newark at the time.
Hugely so, and I felt I'd made it. I really felt I'd made it, and probably what I didn't realise was what I didn't know. How much I genuinely didn't know, and the two things really. One, how important it is to truly, deeply understand how a business works. Not just across the surface. Sure. And secondly, how important it is to be able to deal with setbacks. Those are the two things that throughout my career, have been things I wish the earlier I'd learnt that, the easier my life would have been, for sure.
Right. And from there, you went, I don't quite know how this works, but you went to manage a Volvo dealership in Bristol, as I understand it. How did that happen? I mean,
Yeah.
and what did that teach you in terms of being a leader?
Yeah, well, actually, at Marks and Spencer, I had, I desperately wanted to go and do a degree. I was a management trainee rather than a graduate trainee, and I was working with graduates, actually in charge of them. They gave me a lot of responsibility at a relatively early age, but I had this thing that I had to get a degree. And along came there was this company through a headhunter who said they're looking for people who aspiring young leaders who.
This was Lex, was it?
This was Lex,
Right,
yeah,
okay.
and they wanted me to. They promised me that they would sponsor me to do a degree. They would give me a company car.
A Volvo.
A Volvo, yeah, which Marks and Spencer didn't, and they would pay me, a little bit more money. And my goodness, one of the biggest lessons I learned that, a good boss is worth a lot more than a salary increase. That is for sure. But I went and joined Lex, and it was complete opposite to Marks and Spencer. No training in the early days. A job which I thought was, quite a senior role, and it really wasn't. And it wasn't exactly what I'd anticipated. And, for the first few weeks, feeling sick to my stomach that I'd perhaps made a dreadful mistake, but I couldn't admit it. My dad said to me, "How can you leave Marks and Spencer? This amazing company." In his day, you joined an organisation, you didn't leave.
Right.
And there was me leaving this amazing organisation to work for a company that he'd never heard of, doing a job that he'd never really heard of. What was this all about? I'd been disloyal. And, for the first 6 weeks, I thought he was absolutely right. I got so much wrong. So much so that, at one stage, I was given a final written warning.
Really? Were
Believe
you a difficult employee?
I didn't think difficult, but clearly incompetent is the honest
But wait a minute,
truth.
this is the point at which you got, I'm looking down at my notes here, an MBA with distinction from Bath, is that right?
Yeah, well, that
So how
came
did that come about?
That came along a little bit longer. So it was a brilliant company. Failure, and I had a brilliant boss who said to me, "Look, you really don't know what you're doing, and you're really not admitting it. And what we need to do is to admit that you don't know what you're doing."
This is at Lex?
Yeah, this is at Lex, and I think you need to get rid of this Marks and Spencer arrogance that we are the best at everything in Marks and Spencer, and
So
everything.
this really was a leadership lesson then?
Oh, it was a massive leadership lesson, yeah. Not least somebody taking a risk on me, because quite frankly, he should have probably just fired me at the time.
I hesitate to interrupt your story here because I'm loving it, but that I keep on reading you say things like that about people taking a risk. What was the risk they took on you?
Oh, it would have been really easy for him to say, you're arrogant, you really don't know what you're doing.
Okay.
I'm going to find somebody better.
But he looked beyond that.
He looked beyond it, and he gave me very direct feedback. It's very hard to give somebody direct feedback. It's a thing we all struggle with as leaders because we feel we might hurt or whatever. But he gave me very direct, very clear, unequivocal, evidenced feedback. Brilliant. That left me nowhere to go, and no matter how much denial, no matter how hard it was for me, it was perfect timing, delivered in a way that was, very, very clear that if I didn't learn from it, I would be out on my ear. And he took that risk, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
And you subsequently ended up staying with Lex.
I did.
And they put you through your MBA, which
They
you
did.
passed with flying colours, and it was a springboard to further success.
Yeah, to running the car dealership. Yeah,
So did you end up with his job?
Well, effectively, yes. Not. He went on to bigger and better things. Yeah, he definitely did. He went on to bigger.
You sat
and
in
better
his
things.
chair, okay.
Exactly, I sat in his chair afterwards. Yeah, I'm still in contact with him actually.
Okay, that's
so
good.
it was a great experience. A whole host of things learned from that experience, but I got rid of the chip. About I wanted this degree, and it was a really different job to the one I'd thought I'd applied for.
Right, but if I make a short hop and a skip and a jump here, but it must have instilled some love of cars in you, because you then at the age of, I'll read down from my notes here, at the age of 32, a very youthful 32, you were appointed to the board of motoring organisation, the RAC. And once again, you publicly thanked the people who'd taken a risk on you. So wait a minute, the fella at Lexus knocked the corners off you. And so, what risk were the RAC taking?
Well, this one, yeah. I mean, it was a big job for me to get. And whilst I'd always been in sort of operational jobs, and I'd love things that are operationally focused, it was my first proper managing director, chief executive role. And on paper, was probably one that you wouldn't have obviously given to someone with my background and experience. But yeah, two bosses there gave between the two of them, because it wasn't just this role, but they put me on the board. I was, on the board of a listed business, which
yes, sorry, I didn't make that clear.
Yeah,
managing director and a place on the board.
Yeah, which was again, I tend to get these things right. That's the next thing that I want. That's what I want. I really want to be on a listed board, and that was. A real risk that they took with me. But I love that job. Oh, sure. My goodness, I love that job.
And you were successful until the company was taken over?
That's right, yeah. So we sold the business to Aviva, the insurer. And, of course, I was the corporate overhead. You're never going to want a role like me, as synergy is you basically integrate the business into the organisation, the larger organisation. So there wasn't a role. But they treated me fabulously, and they asked me to help with the integration, which I did for a short period of time. But they gave me an opportunity to sell a couple of their smaller businesses. Mm-hmm. And that in itself, again, another failure, because that gave me time to then apply to do chief exec roles, and I couldn't get one. Mm-hmm. It was every time I went for a role, it was, well, we like you, you're the different candidate, but, we want somebody who's got experience in this sector. So although they started off by saying that's what they wanted, I couldn't get one. So
it was a stuttering start to your non-exec career. However, you were helped at that time by the fact that you were made an MBE, 2011, for services to business and the public sector. And at that time, I love this, you expressed surprise saying, but I do business simply because I enjoy it. So, I'm going to ask across a wider spectrum, is it important that successful leaders enjoy what they do?
Certainly they need to enjoy some part of it. I think any business leader would not be telling the truth to say, I enjoy every single moment, because that's not true. There are tough times as a leader. It can be a lonely existence. But I've had, the privilege to be in roles that I tend to think of three things. Am I learning? Am I influencing things? And am I enjoying it?
Learning, influence, and enjoying.
Yeah, those are the three things. And not all the time, can you be ticking all those three boxes, but you definitely want 2 out of 3. And normally, if you're having a tough time, if it's something, if you're in love with the business that you're working in, when it's a tough time, somehow that sees you through. That's the North Star. I'm doing this for a sense of purpose. I'm doing it because I can see we are making a difference. And to do something that's in a product or with a product that you love and you enjoy and you're interested in, it just doesn't get better than that.
Okay, so let me take you back to your stuttering start of your non-exec career. So you were just coming out of the RAC, you're applying for a lot of non-exec roles, and you're not quite getting the job. How did you get over that hump?
So the decision to go portfolio, as it was called then, we had an opportunity to do a management buy into a business, but it was clear that was never going to be my kind of full-time anchor job. So it was right, go and do a few non-exec roles. It was a bit manic, to be honest with you, at the beginning. It was because I panicked that, I was used to being full on. Doing the chief exec of the RAC, you never close. 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, we're open. And that's how I did that job, basically. Christmas Day, I'd be going into the contact centre because, they had to work, I had to work, or wanted to work.
That's really interesting. Do you feel that's an important part of a leader's role? I've had jobs myself where you have staff working on Christmas Day. I used to pick up the phone to them. I didn't quite get through walking through the door, but you walk through the door and press the flesh while they were there, and you weren't meant to be.
Definitely. Empathy. How you understand what goes on, for sure. Certainly the way I want to go about the role. I'm a real show me, don't tell me kind of person. I want to get into to the guts of the business.
Show me, don't tell me. Yes, I've had a number of people say, explain that one to me.
Yeah, it's the way I learn, actually. If you tell me how something works, it's a very unemotional description of something, whereas you show me how you do your job, the way it works. If you're in a contact centre, come and put the headphones on, listen to the customers that I'm dealing with. If you're fixing a car at the side of the road, come with me. You can tell me on a set of PowerPoint slides how you go about fixing a car. There's nothing like, in the days of the time I spent with RAC, going and standing with the patrol at the roadside when cars are going past at 80, 90 miles an hour illegally, and you're trying to fix a car. All the manuals in the world don't work if you haven't got some common sense. And you really do get to understand the job that somebody does when you go and be with them. There's no substitute for that.
Okay, so you just touched upon it there. You've had a huge array of roles over the last 40 years. Prompts me to ask: do you think you'd have been in charge, whatever happened?
My kids would say so. I've not always been in charge, actually. Of course not. I've been in leadership roles in various different guises, but I'm part of a team too. I think to be a good leader, you've got to be a good follower. I do not think that you can be a good leader if you're not a good follower. You need to understand, when you're part in a team, is to not be the leader. Sure. Actually.
So is that a lot of biting of your tongue and holding your breath?
No, I think it's a real it's a skill to be able to know actually when you're not the best leader, actually, and to step back and to make that really crystal clear. I think it's an important part of the role that we play. Leadership comes in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. Different businesses need different things at different times, and I think the best leaders are able to work that through. I wouldn't say be in charge. I'd say what I've loved and I've thrived on is accountability. You mentioned my portfolio life. When I first started being a non-exec, I struggled a bit, to be honest with you, because I'd gone from being this full-on chief exec who was clearly accountable, and I didn't in the early days feel that accountability. I do now. I've typically gravitated towards to do chair roles, where I felt very specifically accountable. And I think these days non-execs are. Corporate governance has made them much more accountable. So accountability is the thing I've always thrived on. Okay,
so you thrive on accountability, and that must provide some of the most challenging elements of your career. I flicking through the cuts as one does, see you're chair of Restaurant Group, which owner of Wagamama's and Frankie and Benny's, when it closed 250 outlets and made 4,500 staff cuts, then had a very public argument with shareholders over the chief exec's remunerations. Are there things which you reflect upon where you think, Lord Almighty, I wish I'd done that differently?
Oh, definitely. Not that particular case, to be perfectly
So that's the one where you were right?
I'm not sure I was right, but I think, that's a business that had many challenges, many challenges. And, pay is often a thing that, gets the column inches. And, very often it's much more complex than perhaps the headlines suggest. But there's plenty of things I've got wrong in my business life. So
go on, let's have a look at some of those then.
Mainly around people.
Okay.
Yeah, where you haven't made a decision to make a change quickly enough, normally. Or where, in a business you've made assumptions about the way that a market might work. You've put, debt into a business at a time, the market changes. Or you've not put debt into a business at a time you should have done. There's any number of not so good decisions. And you just hope that you've got a team around you who speak up, when it looks like it's not going according to plan. And you hope that you've got the humility and the open-mindedness to know, this is one of my other sort of mantras, really, the difference between when it's your opinion and when it's fact.
And again, I read that. So one of your things is you said leaders should hold a strong opinion lightly. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So look, as a leader, often the highest paid person's opinion counts in many organisations, and how rubbish is that? Just because you are the leader and, the most senior person or the most well paid, does that give you the God-given right to be right? Absolutely not. There are so many times in business where people confuse their opinion with fact. They say things in a way that's so authoritative, but actually it's their opinion. And when you unpack it, it's one of the things that I think, I've learned as I've got older to catch myself, speaking as though it's my opinion and actually as though it's my fact, it's a fact and it's actually my opinion. And I often hear people will say that, that will never work, as though that is factual, but actually that's their opinion. And being able to distill in any discussion where we've got fact and when we've got opinion, and often I've got things wrong when I've confused fact with opinion. And when I've not paused to be sure that it is fact, not opinion, that I'm basing an assumption on. But then having the confidence because listen, there's very few decisions as a leader in big complex organisations where all the facts are clear. Very often you have to go with your opinion, your gut feel. And I found it's really important to acknowledge that yourself, for the people around you to acknowledge it, because then when things do go off track, you're not then busy to find more facts to support why they were facts in the right place.
Digging a bigger hole.
Digging a bigger hole, that's a great phrase. Yeah, absolutely, digging a bigger hole. And I think that's, then about the culture you create as a leader, because you can be open about the fact, I'm not 100% sure. You've got to be careful, because there's nothing, you can't go into every decision and say, well, I'm really not sure about this, because you don't inspire confidence. But on the big things, being really clear with your team, with the business, with your investors, what you are clear about and what you're not, and where you are on assumptions. I think it just makes it so much more transparent, and it's so much easier for people to say, it is going off track because of. Really important as a leader.
Good stuff. You mentioned much earlier in this conversation your 14-year-old twins. I've talked about all the different business roles that you've got. You've got 14-year-old twins. I'm duty bound again to put in the conversation, you still serve as a parish councillor in the village where you live. How does a leader, a busy leader like yourself, find time for all these things?
Well, certainly COVID helped, because most of those meetings are now I am able to dial in rather than to be physically present. Yeah, it's important. I think it's really important to give something back.
Sure.
And I certainly do that.
You see that as giving back?
I do, definitely. Yeah, I do our newsletter, not so well. I'm not brilliant at writing newsletters, but I make it my business to be a magpie around the community. Any ounce of, information that can help anybody in the village, I do a newsletter that goes out to tell them what's happening.
Do you get help with that from the twins, or?
I get help with the tech from the twins, definitely, with that. And I feel it's I'm not often in the community because I travel a lot with the jobs that I do. So when I am in and around the community, I want them to know that I do care about where I live. I do care about the sustainability of where I live, and I do care about the people that live there. And this is just a way of giving something back.
Now, how do you do that in terms of time? How do you portion it up?
I'm quite an organised person.
Right.
I'm a great believer in the saying, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. So I do pack a lot into my life, and I think it's quite important that it's balanced in as much as it's not all just the work stuff. The parish council helps me, and it helps me also with some of the work stuff, some of the planning stuff that you have to deal with on a parish council. Those things happen. When I was working at Restaurant Group, you mentioned Restaurant Group, and we have planning issues, or working in White Stuff where we have stores, we have planning issues. You learn a lot about planning.
Keeps you grounded.
It does, very much so, yeah, absolutely.
Finally, this is a podcast for the Nottingham Business School. So what advice might you offer to the aspiring future leaders who are currently starting their careers at the business school today?
Probably where you started, actually, and asking me about the role when I started that resilience. Failure is not fatal. I think when you start out in your career, setbacks, anything that goes not quite according to the plan, it's the end of the world. I see it with my kids now, when something doesn't quite go according to how they've planned, they don't get a particularly good result or something happens, it's the end of your world. And that sense of perspective that actually, it sounds such a cliche coming from somebody like me, well, you learn more from your failures, but you do. And the resilience to be able to bounce back. It's what I look for in any leader that I take on in any role that I'm recruiting for. I certainly don't want people who've had a perfect career. I want to see the flaws because they are where you learn. They are where you get humility. They are where you establish that robustness, life stuff, and the ability to deal with the grit in your shoe, as it were, is really, truly important. And I think as a youngster, people often say to me, if you could give your kids one thing, what would it be? It would be resilience. If you've got resilience, anything that life throws at you, you handle, and you ultimately end up a better person because of it. So that's the thing. Work on your resilience. You'll not go far off.
Great stuff. That was a genuinely fantastic conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank
Debbie
you.
Hewitt, thank you very, very much for joining us on the Business Leaders Podcast.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, then why not check out some of the others that are also available, including those with the Michelin-starred chef Sat Baines, with the head of Capital One in the UK, Lucy Marie Higgs, or with the chairman of Burberry, Experian and Standard Chartered, Sir John Peace. The Nottingham Business School Business Leaders Podcast is produced for Nottingham Trent University by Celtic Tiger Productions. Your presenter was Mike Sassi and your producer was John Collins.